and shadowy forest stood a hill known as Dead Man's Hill. For generations, the people of the nearby town of Millville had passed down stories about the house that loomed on top of that hill, a house cursed by a dark past and haunted by the malevolent spirits. No one dared to approach it, not even in broad daylight. The house was a relic from another time, a once grand mansion now falling into ruin. Its windows were shattered, its roof caving in, and its walls covered in vines and moss. But it was what lay inside that filled the townspeople with dread. Stories spoke of a wealthy family, the Blackwoods, who had lived there centuries ago, until a series of horrific events left them all dead. The patriarch, Lord Edmund Blackwood, was said to have been a cruel and sadistic man. He ruled over his family with an iron fist, his temper as volatile as it was violent. His wife, Lady Margaret, was a frail woman who rarely left the house, her health deteriorating rapidly under the stress of her husband's cruelty. The Blackwoods had 2 children, a son named Thomas and a daughter named Eliza. Both children were reportedly bright and beautiful, but their lives were overshadowed by the dark presence of their father. The legend goes that one stormy night, after years of abuse, Lady Margaret finally snapped. Driven to madness by her husband's relentless torment, she took a knife and killed Edmund as he slept. But the act of murder drove her further into insanity. In her delirium, she turned on her children, slaying them both before taking her own life. When the townspeople discovered the scene the next morning, they were horrified. The bodies were left where they fell, and the house was abandoned, left to rot. Over the years, those who ventured inside, either out of curiosity or to prove their bravery, never returned the same. Some vanished entirely, while others emerged with their minds shattered, muttering incoherently about the things they had seen. Despite these warnings, there was always someone foolish enough to test the stories. One such person was David Turner, a young man with a passion for the paranormal. He had heard the tales of the Blackwood house, and rather than being frightened, he was intrigued. David fancied himself a ghost hunter, though his experience was limited to a few late-night visits to cemeteries and supposedly haunted houses that were little more than old buildings with creaky floors. When David arrived in Millville, the townspeople tried to dissuade him. They warned him of the danger, recounting the grisly fate of those who had gone before him. But David was undeterred. He believed the stories were nothing more than exaggerated folklore, designed to keep curious minds away from the hill. On a cold October evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, David made his way up Dead Man's Hill. The path was overgrown, and the trees seemed to close in around him as he climbed higher. The wind howled through the branches, carrying with it the scent of decay. By the time David reached the top, the house was looming before him, dark and foreboding. The front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. David hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity won out. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. He shone his flashlight around, revealing a grand but dilapidated entrance hall. A massive staircase led up to the second floor, and to his left was a parlor, filled with cobweb-covered furniture. David began his exploration on the ground floor, moving cautiously from room to room. The kitchen was a scene of chaos. Pots and pans were scattered everywhere, as if someone had left in a hurry. In the dining room, the table was still set with fine china, now covered in a thick layer of dust. But it was the study that caught his attention. The walls were lined with books, many of which had been pulled from the shelves and thrown to the floor. Papers were strewn about, and the desk in the center of the room was covered in strange symbols and markings that David couldn't decipher. As he examined the room, David began to feel a growing unease. The air was colder here, and he could hear a faint whispering, though he couldn't make out the words. He told himself it was just the wind, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Determined to continue, David made his way upstairs. The second floor was even more unsettling. The walls were adorned with old portraits of the Blackwood family, their eyes seeming to follow him as he walked down the hall. The first room he entered was Thomas's bedroom. The bed was neatly made, but the room was filled with a sense of dread. Toys were scattered across the floor, and a small desk in the corner held a collection of drawings. As David looked closer, he saw that the drawings depicted scenes of violence, children being chased by shadowy figures, and a house engulfed in flames. Next, David entered Eliza's room. It was much like her brother's, though there was an eerie calm to it. The bed was unmade, and the wardrobe doors were open, revealing old-fashioned dresses that had long since gone out of style. A music box sat on the dresser, and when David opened it, the haunting melody filled the room. He quickly shut it, the sound sending chills down his spine. Finally, David reached the master bedroom. The door was closed, and as he reached for the handle, the whispering he had heard earlier grew louder. It was no longer a faint murmur, but a chorus of voices, chanting in a language he couldn't understand. David hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest, but he had come too far to turn back now. The door creaked open, revealing a scene of horror. The room was a wreck. Furniture was overturned, and the walls were stained with dark, dried blood. The bed was in shambles, as if a struggle had taken place there. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface cracked and covered in grime. David felt a strange pull toward it, as if something was drawing him in. As he approached the mirror, the whispering grew louder, the voices becoming more distinct. He could make out fragments of sentences, pleas for help, cries of anguish, and curses directed at whoever had entered the room. David's reflection in the mirror was distorted, his features twisted and grotesque. But there was something else in the reflection. Behind him, in the shadows, he could see movement. He spun around, but there was nothing there. When he looked back at the mirror, he saw them. Ghostly figures, their faces twisted in pain, standing just behind him. They were the Blackwood family, their spirits trapped in the house, reliving their final moments over and over again. David stumbled back, the full weight of the house's history crashing down on him. The spirits began to close in, their hands reaching out to him, their voices now a cacophony of screams and wails. David tried to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping him inside the room. The air grew colder, and David felt a pressure on his chest, as if something was squeezing the life out of him. He gasped for breath, his vision blurring as the spirits surrounded him. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the twisted smile of Lord Edmund Blackwood, his eyes burning with malice. David's body was found the next morning by a group of townspeople who had come to search for him. They found him in the master bedroom, lying in front of the mirror, his face frozen in a mask of terror. His camera was beside him, but the footage was corrupted. Nothing but static and faint whispers could be heard. The house on Dead Man's Hill remains standing to this day, a monument to the horrors that took place within its walls. The townspeople continue to warn against venturing up the hill, but the lure of the unknown is too strong for some to resist, and so the house waits, hungry for the next soul, foolish enough to cross its threshold.